What if all the oceans on Earth suddenly disappeared? Imagine waking up to a planet where coastlines stretch for hundreds of miles into barren plains, ships lie stranded on cracked seabeds, and the once mighty waves are gone forever. The air would dry out, storms would change completely, and weather systems that rely on oceans would collapse. Fish, whales, and countless marine species would vanish instantly, and with them, the food chains that sustain humans and land animals. Rivers would shrink, rainfall would become unpredictable, and temperatures could swing to extremes we've never seen. Civilization as we know it would struggle to adapt. Cities that relied on water for drinking, agriculture, and industry would face immediate crises. Stick around, because by the end, you'll see how human survival would be tested like never before, and why the reality is far more devastating than just no water in the sea. I'm Harris, and you're watching What If Harris, where we explore human survival in extreme scenarios. Today, we're imagining a world without oceans. We'll look at how humans would react, the environmental chaos that would follow, and whether survival would even be possible when one of the planet's most vital systems vanishes. If the oceans suddenly disappeared, the Earth would be unrecognizable. Oceans cover more than 70% of the planet, regulating climate, storing heat, and driving weather patterns. Without them, the water cycle would collapse. Evaporation would vanish, clouds would form less, and rainfall would become scarce and unpredictable. Rivers and lakes would dry up over time, leaving much of the land parched. Humidity would drop drastically, making the air feel like a desert even in regions that were once temperate. Oceans also store massive amounts of heat, distributing it from the equator toward the poles. Without that thermal regulation, equatorial regions would scorch under constant sunlight, while polar areas would freeze without the warming currents. Extreme temperature swings would occur daily, making survival extremely difficult. Agriculture, which relies on consistent rainfall and irrigation, would fail almost everywhere. Crops would wither, livestock would struggle, and food shortages would become immediate. Marine ecosystems, which provide roughly half of the oxygen we breathe, would collapse. Phytoplankton, tiny ocean plants that produce oxygen through photosynthesis, would vanish, reducing breathable air and destabilizing life on land. Fisheries, which feed billions of people worldwide, would disappear instantly, leaving humanity without one of its primary food sources. The atmosphere itself would feel different. Winds would shift violently as pressure zones change, creating storms unlike anything we know today. Humans survive today because we rely on oceans for drinking water, food, transport, and climate stability. Remove oceans, and that balance disappears. Water scarcity would become immediate, especially in cities that depend on river inflows and desalination. Coastal cities would no longer face flooding, but inland areas would face drought, heat waves, and uninhabitable deserts. Life support systems, from agriculture to energy production, would be under constant threat. In short, a world without oceans is not just dry, it's chaotic, hostile, and extremely hard for humans to endure. The moment the oceans disappear, the world changes in ways we can barely imagine. At first, the most obvious effect is visual. Vast stretches of dry, cracked seabeds replace the deep blues we're used to. Ships, submarines, and coastal infrastructure sit abandoned on barren plains. But the impacts go far deeper, starting with the environment itself. Oceans regulate temperature by absorbing heat at the equator and redistributing it to higher latitudes. Without them, equatorial regions would start to overheat almost immediately, while polar areas would plunge into extreme cold. Day-to-night temperature swings would intensify, creating conditions that our bodies and crops simply aren't adapted to. Humans would feel the changes within hours. The The air would dry rapidly and humidity would drop to desert-like levels almost overnight. Lungs accustomed to a certain moisture content in the air would begin to dry out, making every breath uncomfortable and slightly painful. Eyes would sting, skin would crack, and blood viscosity could increase slightly due to dehydration, putting extra strain on the heart. People would feel fatigue and headaches more quickly as the brain struggles to regulate temperature and hydration in a rapidly changing environment. Within days, food and water shortages would start to hit. Rivers fed by melting glaciers and precipitation that once depended on the ocean's evaporation would dwindle. Drinking water would become scarce, forcing communities to ration or dig for underground sources. Farms that relied on consistent rainfall and irrigation from rivers would fail. People would experience hunger, low blood sugar, and weakened immune systems, all while trying to navigate a harsher, drier climate. Atmospheric changes would intensify the struggle. Wind patterns, driven by ocean currents and pressure differences, would shift violently. Some regions might experience constant, harsh winds carrying dust and sand, while others could suffer stagnant air that heats quickly during the day and freezes at night. Storms might still occur, but they would be unpredictable and localized, making traditional weather forecasting unreliable. The sky itself would look different as clouds become sparse and precipitation vanishes in many regions. Emotionally, humans would feel the weight of constant stress. Anxiety and panic could spread quickly as cities face water shortages and food insecurity. Social tensions would rise and survival instincts would kick in. People would migrate toward whatever water sources remain, potentially causing conflict. Sleep patterns would become irregular under extreme heat or cold, adding exhaustion to the physical and emotional strain. Over weeks and months, the body would adapt as best it can. Skin would thicken from dryness, kidneys would concentrate urine to conserve water, and people would seek shade or underground shelters during the hottest parts of the day. Communities might develop new ways to capture and store water from the minimal rainfall, or innovate technologies to extract water from soil and air. But these adaptations can only go so far. Life outside controlled environments would remain dangerous, and mortality rates would rise dramatically, especially among vulnerable populations. In the long term, humans could survive in small, isolated regions with access to rivers, lakes, or underground aquifers. Technology would be critical. Desalination, water recycling, indoor farming, and climate-controlled shelters could sustain life. Still, the world without oceans would be harsher, drier, and far less predictable than anything we've experienced. The disappearance of oceans would push humanity to its limits, forcing rapid adaptation or retreat, and making survival a daily struggle rather than a guarantee. The oceans may seem distant to some, but their absence would remind us that they are not just water, they are life itself. If the oceans suddenly disappeared, survival would depend entirely on adapting to a world that is drier, hotter, and far less predictable. The first priority would be securing water. Rivers and lakes would shrink or disappear over time, so humans would need to rely on underground aquifers, desalination plants fed by whatever remaining salt water could be stored, or innovative methods like extracting moisture from the air. Water would become the most valuable resource on the planet, and controlling it would determine who lives and who doesn't. Shelter would also be critical. Without oceans to regulate temperature, many regions would experience extreme heat by day and bitter cold at night. Cities might no longer be safe, especially in former coastal areas where floodplains would be dry but unstable. Underground or insulated habitats could provide stable temperatures and protect against violent windstorms or dust-filled air. Climate-controlled structures would be essential for agriculture, allowing crops to grow despite the collapse of natural rainfall cycles. Hydroponics and vertical farms could replace traditional agriculture, supplying food while conserving water. Technology would play a central role in survival. Advanced filtration and recycling systems could turn limited water into drinkable supplies repeatedly, while energy sources like solar, geothermal, or nuclear power would maintain shelters, farms, and life support systems. Drones or automated machines could perform dangerous tasks outside, from repairing infrastructure to transporting water or building new habitats. Protective clothing could help people survive brief exposure to the harsh environment, but no suit could fully replace a reliable, climate-controlled shelter. Some futuristic adaptations might extend survival even further. Genetic modifications or medical interventions could help humans tolerate heat, cold, or dehydration more effectively. Artificial blood substitutes or enhanced kidneys could conserve water, while energy-efficient breathing systems could help manage oxygen in areas with reduced moisture. Even so, these solutions are largely theoretical and would only help small populations in controlled conditions. What is impossible, however, is surviving outside these controlled systems for long. Without oceans, rainfall, rainwater, humidity, and natural climate moderation vanish. Agriculture in open fields would fail, rivers would run dry, and storms could become unpredictable and deadly. Any attempt to live without access to water, shelter, and technology would quickly prove fatal. Humans cannot adapt fast enough to survive naturally in this drastically altered environment. Ultimately, survival in a world without oceans is possible, but only for those who prepare, innovate, and isolate themselves from the harshest conditions. Life would be concentrated in carefully maintained regions, relying on technology, artificial ecosystems, and sustainable water management. The majority of the planet would become uninhabitable, and humanity would shrink into smaller, highly organized pockets. The oceans may seem distant to many of us, but their absence would make clear just how much human survival depends on their presence and how delicate the balance of life on Earth really is. If the oceans disappeared, the world we know would vanish with them. Temperatures would swing wildly, weather systems would collapse, and water, the source of life, would become scarce and precious. Humans could survive only in small, carefully managed regions with access to underground water, climate-controlled shelters, and advanced technology to grow food and recycle resources. Outside these safe zones, life would be nearly impossible, and the majority of the planet would become inhospitable. Civilization would shrink, concentrated around the few areas that still provide the essentials for survival. This scenario is a stark reminder of how dependent we are on Earth's natural systems. Oceans aren't just water. They regulate climate, produce oxygen, and sustain the food chains we rely on. Losing them shows how fragile our survival really is and how quickly life can be pushed to its limits when the balance of nature is disrupted. It makes you wonder how much of our comfort and stability is really under our control and how much depends on forces far larger than ourselves. If this scenario made you think, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more explorations of extreme what-if situations.